Okay, so just we can
So
go
I'm
with that.
Dr. Vandana Shiva, that is Vandana Shiva. And I direct a research foundation for science, technology, and ecology in India. And I also founded Navdanya, the movement for seed saving and organic farming.
All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch into stuff, some David stuff first. How long have you known David, and how did you two meet?
It seems I've known David forever. And my guess is I first met him when I came to Denver, probably for the G8 summit, which would have been, I can't remember the dates. But David took me to his studio for an interview. And of course, every time he's in India, he always comes over and we have a conversation. We had one just before I left to come and teach at Eugene.
All right. What kind of person is David? We know him on the radio. He's very professional, little, but what is his personality like?
For me, the special part of David is that he could, if you change his skin, he could be Indian. His love for music, his dedication to it. When he comes to visit me in India, he comes in a kurta. And I think he is, in a deep, deep sense, a true global citizen who understands the world in all its diversity and in all its complexity, and has enough of the openness of heart and mind to listen and watch. And therefore, he's always got his pulse on the right thing.
All right. How important is his work with his books and also his archive and alternative radio? How important is that for the world? What kind of stuff is in there?
I think David's work is extremely important for the work because he is, in a way, tracking the history unfolding in our times. He is reporting on the most important issues that are too important for the front page news of purchased media. He is talking to the people who are shaping events, shaping trends. And I think if anyone really wanted to find out what happened in the period of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, all you'd need to do is go to David's archives.
Excellent. Now this might be part of the title of the film in this question. So if you could repeat David Barsamian in your answer, that'd be great. So the question is, who is David Barsamian?
David Barsamian, oh, look at it. Barsamian, yeah. David Barsamian is the voice of our times. He's the conscience of our times. He is alert to everything of significance that is unfolding in the world. And he tracks it, he reports on it, he amplifies it, he analyzes it.
Excellent. Okay, now I'm going to move into some stuff that I pulled from reading some of your work. So maybe more of a personal thing first. How did you end up traveling the world and speaking on the issues that you care about? What motivates you to do your work?
Well, I was an international intellectual. I was doing my doctorate in Canada. So the world has been my stage. But I left university teaching in 1982 and started the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology, thinking, now I won't move. I went back home. I set up the institution in my own valley and had decided to be totally local. And then the disaster started, one after the other. The problems in Bhopal, where thousands of people were killed with the leak of a pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide. That same year, terrorism, extremism in Punjab that took over time 30,000 lives. And two things became very clear when I finished studying what was going on, because I had decided to research the Green Revolution and found it had come from war. It was driven by global corporations. War industry had reshaped agriculture like war. And I learned enough in that period, also because I started to get invited to conferences where the biotech industry laid out its future dreams of patenting every seed, genetically engineering every seed, and having so-called free trade treaties, which would be the end of freedom of citizens, end of freedom of farmers, but of course freedom for corporations to be free of responsibility, accountability, liability. And I realized that my little safe haven in Doon Valley would never be safe enough if these trends continued. And that's when I decided that if part of what I have to carry is imprisonment in aeroplanes, I'm going to do it just because we need pollination and cross-pollination in our times. I'm so happy to be in Oregon for these 3 weeks, because meeting the farmers who are doing seed saving here today because they read my books when they were young college students and decided that seed saving was important. Today, they are the alternative to Monsanto. They are the fighters against the deployment of genetically engineered beet and genetically engineered alfalfa. So really, it's about cross-pollination, it's about solidarity, and it's about taking actions before it's too late.
This is a question that just kind of occurred to me. I'm wondering, you have a background in nuclear physics. Do you support nuclear power?
No, I don't support nuclear power at all. I left my nuclear profession and went into theoretical physics precisely because I realized, through my sister who's a medical doctor, that there are issues of hazards, which we are not taught. As physicists, we are taught to work out how much energy will be released by nuclear fissions. That's what we are taught, and we're very smart at it. But what happens with radiation? We're not taught. That's supposed to be about biology. And I thought this was a very one-sided teaching. I had the privilege of being in our fast breeder reactor, experimental reactor, when during the period it was being made critical. So it was very exciting, I can tell you. It's extremely stimulating when you, as a human being, feel you can unleash all this energy. But you start to get humbled when you realize, A, that you don't know what this energy is doing to life on Earth, and two, you have no idea what you're going to do with the waste that you generate in the process of generating that energy. And so today I'm extremely critical. I'm extremely critical of my government having signed a US-Indian nuclear agreement. I'm extremely critical of the false promise of nuclear that it can replace fossil fuels. We have to go for a carbon-free, nuclear-free future. The sun has given us an abundant energy. The winds give us abundant energy. And in any case, we should not think of wasting energy. I think if we live at levels of energy conservation that give a good life, all the renewables can very, very well take part of all human needs. Of course, big nuclear, big oil won't make big money, but that's the problem. They shouldn't be making big money. They are the ones who are driving us all to the threat of extinction. And I think it's time for citizens directly to stand up against any big industry. And nuclear is one of them.
Let's see, touched on Bhopal. Let's just go with this. How can industrial agriculture be considered economic warfare against the poor?
Industrial agriculture is economic warfare against the poor at many, many, many levels. The first is the materials that it deploys, the herbicides, the pesticides, even the chemical fertilizers are war chemicals. The chemical fertilizers are made in the same factories that made explosives, which is why when Oklahoma was bombed, the state office was bombed, it was a fertilizer bomb. I've heard from security people that the reason Afghanistan is more difficult than Iraq is Iraq had weapons. Afghanistan has the fertilizers that the USA distributed hugely in trying to undo the Soviet influence. And today, all of that fertilizer is being turned back into village-level bombs. Pesticides were designed to kill people. Herbicides were designed for warfare. The tragedy is, today, all these chemicals are being used in agriculture, and they harm the farmer, they harm other species, and they harm the eater, because the pesticide residues end up building up in our food system and poisoning our bodies and our food. But there's a second economic warfare involved. Farmers have to get into debt to buy this. And the entire system has conspired to force farmers into debt. The World Bank created the system of subsidies and loans. The entire world's banks were maneuvered to subsidize this kind of agriculture. $400 billion are spent every year of tax money that goes to subsidize industrial agriculture. This too is economic warfare, because of that 400 billion, you could use so much for vital needs, like not dismantling universities, the big fight going on in Wisconsin, not dismantling healthcare, not dismantling care for those who are unemployed and on the edge of existence. India spends 1.3 trillion rupees on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers alone. That's bigger than our defense budget. You need the last bit repeated?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Tell me when it clears. Still hearing it?
Okay.
Good? Okay. Yes, if we could repeat that last part, that
Yeah.
would be great.
India, which says it doesn't have enough money to get food to the poor, has the luxury to spend 1.3 trillion rupees annually on subsidizing synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. This is bigger than our defense budget, and we don't have a small defense. So money, public money, is being wasted. But when farmers are pushed into debt, for example, as in India with chemicals that are needed for industrial agriculture, and even more importantly with the purchase of new seeds, which I see as a seed slavery. For example, genetically engineered seeds have to be bought every year. And even though Monsanto, which is the biggest player in the genetic engineering field, controlling 95% of the genetic engineering seed market, it has only two technologies. One is herbicide-resistant crops, so you spray more Roundup, and the second is Bt toxin crops, where the plant becomes its own pesticide factory. One is supposed to control weeds, the other is supposed to control pests. But what's the result after 10 years of commercialization? We have super-resistant weeds in America, and now they're thinking of using Agent Orange chemicals, 2,4,3-D, 2,4-D, to spray on these super-resistant weeds. Vietnam was a scandal with Agent Orange. To turn American agriculture as if it was in Vietnam during the Vietnam War is both blindness and irresponsibility. In India, the Bt cotton raised the seed from 5 rupees to about 3,600 rupees a kilogram. The seed has failed to control pests. Pests have increased so much that pesticide use has increased 13-fold. So you have an 8,000% increase in price of seed. You have a 1,300% increase in use of pesticides. That huge leap in cost of production forces the farmer into a debt trap. Farmer is made to believe they're going to be rich. These are miracle seeds, and you don't even have to worry about paying this high debt back. But they get indebted, can't pay back the debt, and 84% of the 200,000 farm suicides that have occurred in India are linked to Bt cotton on the basis of our primary field studies. So industrial agriculture is not just economically harmful, it is creating a design for genocide.
The critics of organic farming say that the global population would not be able to be fed if there was only organic farming. Is that true, do you think? Is there a worry that, you know, blights and viruses and not having enough fertilizer, natural organic fertilizers to maintain a big enough agriculture for this population? Is organic agriculture, in your opinion, a viable option for the globe?
Given the disasters of industrial agriculture, given the lies on which industrial agriculture rests, given the subsidies without which it could not stand, actually, industrial agriculture is the one that's failing to feed the world. Why are 1 billion people hungry in the world? And why is this structural? All famine used to be local and short in space and time. You had a war, you had a famine. The war went, you grew your food again. The current 1 billion hungry are hungry independent of war or natural disaster. This is structural hunger, and it's created by an economic system which makes the costs of production so high that farmers who are growing the food are not eating it themselves, they are paying the debt. And I've seen this myself. Secondly, industrial agriculture is not producing food in any case, it's producing commodities. These commodities are going to drive cars, these commodities are going as feed. 30% of US corn is going for biofuels, 40% is going for feeding animals. This isn't a surplus agriculture, it's a scarcity creating agriculture. But even more importantly, the very inputs on which it is based, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, we are running out of these at the mineral synthetic level. Nitrogen fertilizer is made from fossil fuels. We are running out of fossil fuels, it won't go on forever. As far as phosphorus is concerned, the world has only 20 years more of deposits. We'll have to turn to ecological sources because we can't keep mining when there is no mining minerals left. Our work in India has shown that first, biodiverse organic systems and small farms produce much more food than industrial systems do. We are now releasing a report called Health Per Acre, in which we are calculating not just the production per acre, but we are translating that production into nutrition. If agriculture was done in the way we do it in Navdanya, through biodiversity, through ecological systems, India could be feeding twice the population that India has today. And people would be getting nutritious food. If you measure food output rather than yield of commodities, ecological systems are far more productive. And if you measure nutrition per acre and food output per acre, actually small farms are the way agriculture should be done, because you can't work with biodiversity on mega scale. You have to have the care ingredient. And when you have the care ingredient, you have to have a smaller scale. So India is fed, India's 1.2 billion population is fed by farms that are on an average 2 acres. On the other hand, the United States has these giant-sized farms, and they have not been able to remove the hunger of the world. So I think we need a change in paradigm. We need to measure food productivity differently. We need to take into account the natural resources going into the food system, not just the labor. The only reason it is said that American agriculture is efficient is because they count only labor as an input. So you can have a 100,000 square mile farm and one man looking after it with lots of machinery. But if you take that input of resources and energy into account, this is an inefficient farm because it's using 10 units of energy input to produce 1 unit of energy as food. When in ecological systems, You can put in 1 unit and get 2 units. You can put in half a unit and get 2 units. So we are doing the wrong thing. And the only people whom industrial agriculture has served is agribusiness, which sells these chemicals as inputs on the one hand and buys back cheap commodities from the farmers. The farmers lose both ends. The Cargills, the Monsantos, the ADMs win at every level. And they weren't satisfied with ripping off the American farmer. They now want to reach the world through the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, the WTO Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. This is expanding the war against farmers to a global scale.
Can you talk about, well, maybe I'll shift gears first. Well, okay, can you address human overpopulation as it relates to starvation and agriculture?
Well, the issue of population as a problem is related to displacement of people from the land and from agriculture. As long as people have stable livelihoods in agriculture, you never have a population explosion, as it's called. And India and Scotland are very clear examples. India had a stable population till 1800. That's around the time when the British took over and started to change our land ownership laws, displaced peasants on a very large level, and the population started to grow. In Scotland, after the Highland clearances, which displaced peasants and put sheep on the land, the population started to grow. Populations grow when all you have is your labor power to live on. If you have your land as your security, you will work out your carrying capacity with respect to the land. But when you have been displaced and all you have is the hands, then it makes sense to multiply the hands.
All right, so let's see. How about what is corporate terrorism, and can you provide us with an example?
Well, corporate terrorism is corporations unleashing terror on innocent people using instruments of totalitarian control and undemocratic governance. Monsanto is an example of corporate terrorism. Look at what it's done to Indian farmers, pushed so many to suicide. Look at what it did to Percy Smicer, a seed breeder in Canada, whose canola they corrupted through contamination. And then they sued him $200,000, saying, "You have stolen our genes." Percy turned around and said, "But if your genes are in my crop, they're here as pollution, I don't want them, so you are the polluter and you should pay." Monsanto insisted that the ownership of genes gives them the right to own the crops of farmers through contamination. This case went all the way to Supreme Court. The fine was struck down, but the courts recognized that if you allow patenting of genes, then these are the consequences. Monsanto is unleashing terror around the world by stealing our governments from us. We had a very, very good law, and still have it. It's called the Rules for Genetic Engineering under the Environment Protection Act. Monsanto is using the United States government and its lobbying power to have that law changed and replaced by something called the Biotechnology Regulatory Authority Act of India, which would give absolute clearance without stopping to Monsanto and would throw people like us who criticize genetic engineering into jail. In Europe, Monsanto has been known to try and influence governments. There is a very, very intimate relationship between the Food Safety Authority of Europe and Monsanto and the biotech industry. I know personally dear, dear friends as independent scientists who did honest work for their governments. And when that work showed that there are hazards to genetic engineering, there is organ failure, there is shrinkage of brains, there's collapse of immunity, scientists like Arpad Putzai were driven out of their work. Scientists like Professor Seralini of France were hounded. Luckily, he won the case against the biotech industry, which was trying to get him totally removed from his job. So Monsanto is spreading terror by stealing our seeds, by stealing our farmers' lives. It's spreading terror by stealing our democracies. It is spreading terror by stealing our knowledge.
Excellent answer. Let's see here. Well, let me ask you something. Simple question that might be complex. What kind of world would you like to live in?
I would like to live in a world where I wouldn't have to fly around. I would like to live in a world where I would feel that the farm we have built and the seeds we have saved are safe. They will not be contaminated. They will not be turned illegal just because Monsanto got hold of our seed laws and tried to make seed saving illegal. I would like to live in a world where every hardworking person, every farmer, can look into the future, look into 7 generations and say, if 7 generations down, my children want to farm, this land should be in their hands. There should be a food economy in which they have a role. I would like to live in a world where our governments have not been hijacked by corporations and we do not live in corporate state totalitarianism, which is the state of politics today, which is why alfalfa that has been made illegal by the courts is brought back by the executive. Of course, there is huge influence on our governments, and I would rather have our governments, first and foremost, reduce their favoring corporations dramatically. Remember that they are actually supposed to be servants of the people. They're supposed to be in a democracy of the people, by the people, for the people, not by the corporations, of the corporations, for the corporations. And the world that I envisage, the world for which I work, is a world full of diversity, both cultural and biological, a world full of children's welfare and laughter, a world where we can look into the future and say, yes, millions of years down the line, the human species will still be on this planet, taking care of it and taking care of each other.
How much time do we have left? So we're about half. Okay. About halfway through. You doing okay?
Mm-hmm.
You're falling asleep myself. Let's see.
Some water.
Yeah, just some water.
I was reading your tree hugger.
Uh-huh.
Your tree hugger.
Yeah, Chipko?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So amazing.
Well, okay, let's go there and let's talk about that. About, let's talk about the Chipko movement. What is it? And I guess what is it?
Well, I call Chipko my University of Ecology. I went to the University of Western Ontario to do a PhD in the foundations of quantum theory, specifically on hidden variables and non-locality in quantum theory. And I went to Chipko as my University of Learning Ecology. Chipko was a movement that started in my region in the 70s, early 70s, when our forests were being trashed. They were being logged on a very, very large scale. And the idea was that forests bring revenue, they create, cutting down of forest brings you growth. And growth is the religious tenet of every government in the kind of distorted economic situation we are in. But the women who had to bring forest produce, they had to bring fuel, they had to bring fodder, most importantly, they had to carry water that the forest provided. They rose and said, we will hug the trees. You will have to kill us before you kill the trees. And Chipko does mean to hug, to embrace. From the early 70s to the early 80s, they carried on, village after village, forest after forest. And I spent every vacation in that period as a volunteer, drafting, writing reports, translating what women said so that the governments could read and not ignore them just because they were village women. Chipko changed forest policy in India. What the women were saying, these forests don't bring us timber and revenue and reason. That's not their first produce. The first produce of these forests is soil, water, and pure air. And of course, they were first ridiculed. Then we had a 78 flood. The government realized they were spending so much on flood relief that the revenues they collected was nothing compared to the damages. And now we have, in the international climate negotiations, a whole section devoted to the air contribution of the forests. So soil, water, air as the primary contributions of the forests was a science that came from illiterate women, but extremely knowledgeable and extremely wise women. And because I was doing all this while I was doing my PhD in physics, I got very, very humbled. I realized you can have knowledge without a PhD. I also realized that women who have to work with nature to provide sustenance are probably the best experts we have on ecology. And that's why they've been my teachers forever. If I want to learn something, I just turn to rural areas, I turn to women. That's where I get my answers, not from universities.
Okay, I want to go into some water stuff, but first I want to do some more David, a couple more David things. Do you have a funny personal story that about David? Okay, and
yeah.
and anything meaningful.
Yeah.
Are we good?
No,
Should we? You want tighter?
I just get a little.
Okay. Well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, that looks good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a very funny story about David. David normally comes to India in the winter. And last year, in the winter of 2010, must have been January, our government was trying to unleash something called the Green Hunt. They were presenting it as controlling the Maoists. But in reality, what was happening was everywhere tribals were rising against mining, against factories, and were not allowing this dream economy of globalization, where every mineral is mined and every inch of land is taken over from the poor. That resistance of the tribals was becoming a major block. So the government found militarization has always been extremely comfortable for corporate capitalism, and they thought, unleash 70,000 troops into these areas, flush out the tribals, you have easy access to the minerals, and you've done it in the names of cleaning up the security threat from the Red Terror. We knew what this was about, so we started a campaign. And we, later in the year, were going to organize a big tribunal. But the young people decided they were going to do a candlelight vigil for the tribals against this Operation Green Hunt. And the initiative was coming from students of the Indian Institute of Technology, which is near where we live. And we got the message, and we trotted off. And it was a very funny place because they were doing it on a flyover, going over a highway. So first of all, crossing a highway, crossing a road with no lights, to get to this flyover was a challenge. We did it. And then we were there, not too many people, about 100. We were there with our candles. And suddenly, I find David on this flyover in India on a protest against Operation Green Hunt. But that's David, to turn up in unpredictable situations where his conscience tells him he needs to offer solidarity.
Let's see, we talked about hitting on mining. We have laptops and cell phones and paved roads and cars and all these things that we think we need anyway, that cameras, and we need to mine to get the minerals to have these things. How do we do that in a responsible manner? Is it possible?
Well, I think it's extremely possible to live as human beings on this planet with full responsibility of the consequences of our actions, whether it is having cameras and phones or having highways. The problem really is that we as citizens are never allowed to participate in the decisions, never provided the information that, if you get a cell phone, this is what will have to be mined under these circumstances. So how many cell phones do you want? Or how many people can share one cell phone? Or all kinds of options that people would make. This is the kind of urban sprawl. This is what happens when you mine limestone. The water disappears. The corporations, instead of allowing citizens to participate in democratic decisions about the shape of the economy, how we run it, what do we have, basically corporations keep people out and turn us only into consumers and use their powerful advertising and their sales pitch to make all kinds of things look necessary for our lives. So if they put a Walmart and they destroy a local supply, then the car becomes vital to get to the Walmart. But if, as is the case in India right now, where we have not only retail next door, we have a vegetable vendor coming in the morning. He's my morning alarm. He'll tell you about the brinjals and the tomatoes he's carrying with a little vendor cart, and he stops in front of your gate. If you don't have money in that day, he will give you the vegetables and collect the money tomorrow. If you haven't changed for the morning and are not in a sari and are still in your night clothes, he'll carry the vegetables up to you. Now that to me is the highest level of an economy. I don't need a car, I don't need to waste my money, and I don't need to suffer Walmart. But because we are not being allowed to participate in the designing of our society, we have this imposition of high cost consumption, of which we are totally ignorant till someone finds out, oh, it takes these minerals to make a cell phone, or these are the minerals that go into a computer, or this is how electronic waste is piling up and is being dumped on China and India. If we knew all those consequences, we would design a better society. We wouldn't design it the way corporations design it, to take resources through violence, mainly through mining, and then dump resources through the second level of violence, which are waste dumps which nobody wants. All of this wastage of resources and this limitless exploitation of nature is a symptom of an economic dictatorship. If we work and start shaping economic democracy, we will know how to reduce our plunder of the planet.
So let's see. What is that? Do you hear that? Oh, good. It's going on. Okay, let's see. Another David question. And when I met David, I was going to do and I still may, a film based on the book you did with Noam Chomsky, targeting Iran. And can I ask you a couple of Iran questions, maybe two, in case I end up making that film? Okay, we'll go there in a second. But first, another David question. If every adult in the world listened to the alternative radio archive, would the world be a very different place?
If every person in the world listened to the alternative radio and listened to all the effort that David has made to record our times, the world would be a better place because it would be an informed world. So much of what's wrong with politics today is because it's based on ignorance or deliberate creation of ignorance. And that's what's then leading to support for further destruction of democracy. I think if we have to have robust, vibrant democracies, listening to alternative radio would be vital. And having access to alternative radio, which means the democracy of the media, is a very, very vital part.
Okay. Now, you were talking about the fly in the earlier story when you saw David, flyover, is that the same as an overpass?
Overpass, we call them flyovers.
Would you be able to tell that story in a shorter form and using
With the word overpass?
With the word overpass?
Okay, for sure. Yeah. One of the strangest places I have met David was on an overpass in India, on foot. We weren't in cars. We were organizing to stop the government from deploying the military and armed forces and armed paramilitary forces in the forest regions of India, in the tribal area, pretending it was to clean up the areas of the red threat of the Naxalites and Maoists, but in reality to clean up the areas of the tribals who have been resisting mining in their areas. And we had a candlelight vigil, and the young people thought the overpass was a good idea because the traffic going by underneath would see us all. I went for solidarity. Everyone else was a student. I didn't expect to find anyone but a student, but there on the overpass was David with a candle.
Excellent, thank you very much. What is, let's do some, all right, how about this? This is a question, I think I lifted this right from yourself. How does the ecology of terror show us the path to peace?
The ecology of terror shows us the path to peace because ecology means understanding connections. And the ecology of terror allows us to understand the connections between a military-industrial complex that has to keep selling weapons, has to keep creating wars. It's lubricant. It shows us the connections between media control that allows hysteria to be built up in societies to support wars. It shows us the connections between diversions from economic crisis where money should be going instead of to wars. The cultivation of a psychology of fear, which makes everyone feel this war is justified because it's saving me and protecting me somehow. And it therefore connects the crisis of domestic politics and domestic democracy with overseas wars that are fought. And connecting those dots through understanding the ecology of terror and ecology of war then allows us to move into an ecology of peace in which we connect economies of peace, cultures of peace, and politics of peace.
Nice. And can you give an example of water privatization being an act of terrorism?
Well, I worked with, I'll start this again. The two examples of water privatization, which I've been very privileged to be part of fighting and resisting, and both have a lot of lessons for the whole world. One was the case of Coca-Cola stealing the water in a village called Plachimada in India. And the women who have to collect the water were now walking 10 miles for clean, safe drinking water. And eventually they rebelled and said, this company must shut down. We will not walk further. They invited me to support them, which I did. We shut that plant down. And recently the government of Kerala has fined Coca-Cola $38 million for the damages it has done in terms of depleting and polluting the groundwater of Plachimada. In Delhi, one of the world's biggest privatizing companies called Suez d'Egremont was trying to get hold of the city supply. And of course, the World Bank is the agency that gives loans for privatization and pushes countries to privatization. When I came to know about this, we built up a major movement for water democracy and mobilized all the way from where the water would come, which was from the Ganges River in my area of Uttarakhand. It would divert water away from irrigation. And in Delhi, it was based on an act of terror because the public supply was being treated as a leak. So all the free supply in the slums was going to be shut down. And only people who could buy water would have access to water. So you had terrorism up in the high reaches of the Himalaya, where a dam displaced 100,000 people and is still continuing to displace because it's so unstable, this dam, that there are new landslides taking place, villages are slipping into the valley. It's a terror against farmers who lose their water to grow food. It's a terror against the poor because in a privatized urban area, the poor have no right to water, whereas when the water is a public good, then the poor have a right to water. Well, we organize, mobilize, and we managed to stop that privatization.
Okay, looks like we got about 10, 13 minutes or so. Okay, how about an Iran question?
Iran or Iraq?
Iran.
Okay.
Iran. So, Iran has the world's second largest oil and natural gas reserves. Is a U.S.-led attack on Iran inevitable?
In my view, it should not be inevitable to declare war against any country. And I think oil and gas wars are so wrong because they're not just wars against a country that controls the oil and gas. They end up being wars against the planet because when you keep pushing this oil addiction, you are pushing climate change and climate havoc. Now, the American hunger for Iranian gas is behind the US-India nuclear deal and is behind the pressure put on India to not go through a brilliant solution, which was to have Iran gas supplied via Pakistan to India and then further east. That gas pipeline would have been the biggest peace project. Because if India and Pakistan had to look after a pipeline going through their regions, they would both be protecting it and instead of fighting each other. And by forcing India to give up a role in that pipeline, in a way, what the United States has done is have more people to support an attack on Iran to control its gas.
Should the global community allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon?
I think the global community should work against nuclear power and nuclear weapons across the world. Everyone knows that to have a nuclear weapon, you just have to have nuclear power. The same instruments allow you to design a weapon. So how can America be pushing nuclear power on India through a US-India nuclear agreement and say nuclear is good in India but bad in Iran?
Okay. Let's see. Can you talk a little bit about can I ask you about your thoughts on Obama? Is that something you'd be willing to talk about?
Sure.
How do you see President Obama, his policies? Do you see them differing much from his predecessors in the United States?
On issues that affect India, Obama policies are no different from Bush policies. When President Bush came, he wanted India opened up for Monsanto and Walmart. When President Obama came, he wanted India opened up for Monsanto and Walmart. If Bush pushed Monsanto domestically in the United States, it's the Obama regime that has given a go-ahead to alfalfa against court decisions. It has given a go-ahead and undermined the democratic processes that were allowing American citizens to shape a GMO-free agriculture. So as far as corporate control over the White House is concerned, it doesn't matter who's the occupant. The corporate control is what matters.
Is agriculture, you got a couple more questions. Is agriculture good for the wild creatures that we share the planet with?
An agriculture that is wild is good for the wild creatures. For me, an agriculture that is wild is an agriculture that is biodiverse. So the farm looks like a forest or looks like a prairie. it has all the diversity. And agriculture that is wild has wild seed. When I talk about wild seed, I mean seed that can grow under its own conditions. Seed that is open pollinated, seed that is constantly adapting. And I am absolutely thrilled that during my visit to Oregon, I have met one young couple that they say they were inspired by my work on seed. They have created a seed company called Adaptive Seeds. The adaptive capacity of the seed is at the heart. Frank Norton, a farmer who's fighting the genetic engineering industry right here, is also a seed saver, a seed producer. And the language he uses is the language our farmers use about what the seed is. And that kind of wild seed. And his firm is called the Wild Garden Seed. So here's a deep consciousness emerging that if you are cultivating the wild as if it is the wild, maintaining the freedom of the species, if you're not using synthetic fertilizers which kill soil organisms, synthetic pesticides which kill all beneficial insects, actually your farms are supportive of the wild. And I'll give you just two examples. We've done studies on our ecological farms with biodiversity versus chemical farms, and the population of pollinators is huge. Those butterflies and bees love the flowers of farms as gardens. And we have also seen that in ecological systems, the chain, the food web that is maintained in agriculture is sometimes even more dense than in forest ecosystems. So we can farm in nature's ways, and we can then protect all other species.
This is, okay.
No, don't change the tape.
We gotta finish up. This will run out at an hour, so it'll be our clock. If David was sitting in this room, and you might not see him for a while, or you hadn't seen him for a while, is there something that you would say to him that might come to mind?
Well, what I would love to ask David is to give us a program that connects Wisconsin, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and everyday politics in the rest of the world.
Okay, and can you talk about your mother and father and the influence they had on you?
Oh, my parents have had huge influence on us without wanting to influence us. My father was a forest conservator who had earlier served in the British Army. My mother was a highly educated educator who became a refugee during the partition and then decided to become a farmer. So my childhood was in the forest and on her farm. And even though I was here chasing Einstein and wanting to be a physicist, those influences of childhood were important. But I had two things that I especially learned from my parents. One, the virtue of simplicity. They lived such simple lives. And we would watch other mothers who had sari on sari, and our mother would have 4, and our dad had lived in one suit throughout his life. And they used to tell us, you know, we can either indulge in consumerism, or we can take care of you and share with the community. And they'd rather use, and they weren't poor, but they lived in simplicity. They lived in voluntary simplicity. And the second beautiful thing that I learned from my parents was the biggest gift you can give to anyone else is not force anything on them. And our parents gave us so much freedom. They said, creating the context for a person's evolution is a gift of freedom. You don't say, do this and don't do this. You never told me, be a doctor, be an engineer, be a civil servant. They said, you want to be a physicist? Be a physicist. Sometimes I'd say, no, I don't want to be one. They said, fine, don't do that. When I gave up a university career, they never said, oh my God, what will happen to your salary? My mother just gently said, come and use the cowshed. So my research foundation was started from my mother's cowshed.
Okay, I think we have 2 more questions.
Quick, 5 minutes.
Well, let's see. I might. Okay, can you talk about, is Obama's Middle East policy the same as the Bush-Cheney administration?
From where I am, it looks the same.
Okay, and then I can ask you one more and then ask if there's anything you want to add. How about, okay, despite massive global opposition before the bombing of Iraq, the latest time around, the occupation that's been going on, still going on. Before that happened, there was massive opposition across the globe, and the US and Britain got their way anyway. Is there any hope that we would be able, people who would oppose military action against Iran or North Korea, is there any hope that the government would listen to us?
Well, if you look at the parts of the Arab world where no one expected people rising, look at Libya. People are rising. And I think people around the world need to take encouragement and inspiration from the fact that a dictatorial decision that goes against the democratic will of the people, that if it can be stopped in the Arab world, why shouldn't it be stopped in the so-called free world?
Excellent. Okay, last question. Is there anything that you want to add? You might not be.
No, just all strength to David.
All right, we are done. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to take a peek in your office and make sure we got everything out and put everything back, because we originally set up in there and then didn't like it so much.